Hi everyone. This week I'm very pleased to have Gareth Shanthikumar on the couch with Liam Demo as my Movember campaign focuses on men and mental health. Gareth is the co-founder of Man Up, a not-for-profit peer-to-peer education service in WA to empower young men to grow into healthy men by equipping them with the skills to deal with real-life stresses. It is also about redefining masculinity by changing the phrase man up to mean something positive, to live authentically from one's heart, embrace vulnerability, and hold one another accountable to stand up for what is right. Here's our interview. Hi, Gareth.
How you going?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you so much for having me here. So first of all, Gareth, what does Man Up do and what drives your passion?
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me as well. And this is a great mission and it's very important. So Man Up is a not-for-profit organization that I started alongside a mate of mine, Hasib. And we started this company in 2019-20. And basically the main goal of what we do is we go into high schools to speak to young boys about forming healthier understandings of masculinity and mental health. The idea is it's very peer-to-peer. So we go in as a group of volunteers, all aged 18 to 25. And from there, we speak to the kids that are in high school to kind of show them that, you know, we're just a few years older than them and we've had our own experiences. How can we share our stories to almost teach them lessons so that they don't make the same mistakes as us and so they can grow up with the skills equipped so that they can handle whether that's poor mental health, relationship breakdowns, and understanding masculinity within themselves.
Tell us, what do you think some of the challenges are currently when we talk about masculinity, especially the concept of toxic masculinity? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's the idea of toxic masculinity is essentially where masculinity in itself has been taken to an extreme. At no point in our discussion do we ever say to be masculine is bad, being a man is bad. And sometimes a lot of these young boys, they think that is what the messaging is. They will hear the word toxic masculinity and they think that being masculine is toxic, right? So I'll give you an example of, I guess, some masculine traits. For example, being assertive, being dominant, perhaps being someone who brings the money home, traditional kind of male stereotypes. Nothing wrong with them. However, the toxicity kind of comes in when a man or a woman, usually men obviously, feel trapped to conform to these masculine ideals to feel self-worth essentially. So if I don't get money for the family, I'm a failure. So a lot of young kids, especially as they're forming their ideas of masculinity, they can't disconnect that being a man doesn't have to always be masculine. They think that they have to be masculine all the time. And that's when that pressure comes because we're all human first. We will go through moments of vulnerability. We'll step into more feminine, traits essentially. But then when they feel the pressure to be like that all the time, that's when it becomes quite unrealistic. And then it dives into that poor mental health realm, whether that's their own mental health or the way they show up in the community and potentially put others at harm. And we see this a lot with, the statistics around sexual assault and harassment and things like that. So masculinity inherently is not toxic. What becomes toxic is when there's a pressure to conform to masculine ideals, so much so that you go against yourself and you go against, what's healthy.
Where do you think some of these pressures come from?
It's come from a lot of places. I would say maybe traditionally it came from my parents, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, all who grew up maybe in an environment where you had to be like that. You had to be tough, strong. And then look, this goes thousands of years ago back to perhaps the caveman days where, men were the providers. They had to go hunt. They had to be strong. Whereas nowadays, we're not running from tigers and leopards anymore, right? We're living at home. Basically, both men and women can step into each other's gender roles. There's not really like, you have to be like this. However, I think social media has now fast forwarded this because a lot of kids will now jump on and they'll see things like Andrew Tate, for example, where at times can preach a very unhealthy message. Beyond the parents, it's definitely coming from social media as well. And we see this a lot more in the rural communities that we visit. And these students obviously are growing up with fathers who are very traditional, fathers who are homophobic, fathers who tell these guys to man up and stop crying. So these boys grow up with that same mentality and we can see that the cycle continues in those regions, which is why it's even more important that we go and do the work there.
Yeah, it's really interesting you talk about the pressures, like for example, coming from dads, because they themselves had the same pressure when they're growing up.
Yeah.
And they never really thought about getting out of that entrapment, so they pass it on to their kids.
Yeah.
Do you think the pressure can also come from women?
Oh, for sure. 100%.
How so?
Well, again, look, this kind of goes down to social media to an extent as well. And I'll keep it in the realm of like young people because that's who we work with. And I saw how the girls and the guys interacted with each other. And a lot of the messaging, for the girls these days as well which is great, is obviously around empowerment. Like step into the woman boss that's inside of you. And there's 100% nothing wrong with that. However, there are also extreme, women who's pushing an agenda around putting men down. And so a lot of guys now see these messages and they think, girls think I need to be strong and rich and make a lot of money for them to like me. I better step into that role as well. And I've seen young girls look at men who are maybe short, maybe not muscly, maybe don't have a lot of money, and they'll say, that's not a man. But the message that I tell to young boys who interact with a woman like that is, that's not the woman for you.
At what point do you think a young boy will realize something is not right with their mental health?
I can almost relate my story in this to an extent as well, because growing up when I was in high school, I was for sure faced with a lot of stress and mental challenges, but I would ignore it and I wouldn't think that it was a real problem, because especially for myself, coming from an ethnic background as well, where my parents had to, face a war, leave their country, I looked at my stress and I thought, it wasn't important enough, and a lot of kids in school, they might feel the same way, like, I've got an exam coming up, my girlfriend's not messaging me, she's leaving me on silent treatment or whatever. It might not be like big enough for them to like worry, but I feel like this is the incorrect approach, because what tends to happen is when we invalidate our emotions, it builds, right? And so that's what happened to me. 2017, the year where I just basically ignored all the stress that I was feeling, because, on the surface, I had a good life, food on my plate, I had a house to live in, why am I complaining? But then as that year went on and as I kept invalidating the emotions, bottling it in, it came out in unhealthy ways. And for me, that looked like getting aggressive, getting physically aggressive as well, pushing away my loved ones, including my partner at the time. And so I think for a lot of young people, those are the warning signs, like, are you starting to change your behavior now? And they don't realize it, because for me, I didn't realize it until my girlfriend broke up with me, until I had to go to the hospital, you know what I mean? Like, it's until something almost so bad happens that we wake up. And so the idea is, as a young person, if they can develop that awareness of something's wrong, like I'm not feeling good, it's okay to validate my emotions.
How do you suggest to parents to help identify some of these symptoms?
First step for parents is understanding that their kids' challenges are different to theirs. So, our parents might have had completely different situation. That was their challenge for their generation. Whereas these younger generation, they have their own challenges. Social media, pressures to conform, all this kind of stuff. Rather than judging that and being like, that's not a real problem, it's how can you look at this and be like, okay, this is this generation's challenge. How can I accept that, validate that, allow them to be heard, right? That's like step one. And then obviously the biggest thing is noticing a change in behavior, right? So if your kid is always happy, jumping around, and then, for 2 weeks, they just start moping around, they miss out on training, they love going to basketball, they skip that, don't hang out with their friends anymore, or vice versa. Maybe they're a relatively quiet child and then all of a sudden they're really hyperactive and engaged. And these are all signs of perhaps something's going on, because mental health can really show in different ways. It doesn't have to always be sadness and depression. Can you develop an element of vulnerability where you can talk to them? Because I think, especially for my parents as well, the game changed for me when I saw like my dad cry for the first time.
Right.
And it took me 19 years for me to see that. And so when I did see that, I was like, wow, he's a human too. And we began that connection and conversation around our mental health together, which never happened before. So as a parent, are you able to express vulnerability, tell them that you too have struggled through things, because it allows them to feel comfort that they are also going through things, and you can begin that conversation, because a conversation is what's needed to identify and see if there actually is something wrong.
Yeah. Why do you think stigma exists around mental health and men and mental health?
Yeah. I think the stigma around mental health has perhaps come from this understanding that it's not real, because, when you break your arm, you can see it, the bone's sticking out, and you go to the doctors and they fix it, right? Whereas, if you have a mental thing going on, you're stressed out or something happened to break up, you can't see it. And so sometimes because you can't see it, we don't think it's real. So right now, what's kind of happening in society is we're shining awareness on the fact that it is real. And then following on to your question around why it affects men as well, the stigma's there, is because, again, it goes down to stereotypes, right? It goes back down to traditional masculine role, which is don't cry, don't be weak. And so a lot of guys we speak to, they'll think that if they open up or speak about their problems, their friends would laugh at them, they'd feel like they're being a burden on them. And because they're a man, they need to figure it out themselves. Look, figuring things out yourself is very important, but sometimes you can't. We as humans are social creatures. We can't do anything by ourselves. So we need to learn to confide in others. It's interesting because, again, I ask the kids this question. I say, put your hands up if you'd be there for a friend, right, who's going through something. All the boys put their hands up, right? Like, my friend is not a burden to me. I'm going to be there for them. And then I'm like, all right, cool, keep your hand up now. If you would open up to them, if you were going through something, like first thing, all put the hands down again. I'm like, why? They're like, because I'd be a burden. But then I'm like, you just said that your friend wouldn't be a burden to you. Why would they think that you're a burden to them? And then they're like, oh, true. So there's this invisible kind of layer which we need to get rid of. And the way to get rid of that is through conversation. And again, opening it through vulnerability, like crying in front of your mate, for example. I know that my friends, we have connected the way we have because we've all seen each other at our worst. And it almost like creates this family bond, like you're now connected more than ever.
Yeah. How do you think we can improve the awareness so that we can minimize particularly the suicide rates amongst young people in Australia? Because that is actually escalating. It's not even Australia, it's global.
Suicide is the worst point of mental health, essentially, right? You know, depression, anxiety, everything can build, and the worst possible outcome is suicide, right? There's so much that can happen before the intervention for someone to be here. So if someone's here, like whoever was around this person really missed a lot of clear signs. But it wasn't their fault that they missed the signs. It was because they weren't educated and aware of the signs. Yeah. It's about educating ourselves on the signs that someone is heading down that pathway of poor mental health. Sometimes we think that talking about, you know, what we're going through is not going to fix. But I'm a big believer in energy. And energy can get stored within our body if we don't expel it, essentially. Yeah. Just by talking, we kind of allow space for that energy to move through us, you know, because at the end of the day, you know, energy in motion, it moves. It doesn't have to be stuck. It only gets stuck when we allow it to. That's why things like Lifeline or talking to a friend is so important, because it literally forces that to get into motion, right? When a person is in that dire situation, sometimes it does feel like they can't do anything, which is why having, I guess, a support system is important. The next thing I kind of focus on, which is what Man Up is big on, what I'm big on, is how can you begin to develop your self-worth? At the end of the day, you know, we do have one life. And when we look at life in itself, it can be quite meaningless because, you know, we're just here. Like, why are we here? That's why we need to somehow develop self-worth and a meaning to this life so that we can enjoy it without it being the dark, depressing kind of place. And that looks like having support systems, because I think relationships are the key to life. You know, like we can have all the money in the world, have the nice house, but if you don't have people, what's the point? So I always talk about just build a community, you know, like whether that's friends, family, find one person you trust and this person you talk about anything to them. And if they're the right friend, they will stay around. So that's another thing to a lot of young kids, is they feel like this situation is everything, like the end of the world, right? But taking your life is also the end of the world, and you can't come back from that. Whereas if you're in a pretty bad situation and, you know, you can't get out of it, understand that that feeling will pass. If you stay alive, like it will simply pass. That's just the way it is. And then if you can just kind of hang on to that idea or thought that it will pass, how can I learn to just feel this feeling? And it feels like shit, you know what I mean? Like I had to myself where I just feel it, you know, like you embrace it, feel it in your body, but then allow it to be released. And that release looks like talking to someone, going to the gym, right? Finding a healthy outlet, going for a walk on the beach, journaling, meditating, even eating the right food. All of these things contribute to your self-worth and your value of yourself. Because I think when someone loves themselves, it's very difficult to want to leave this earth.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you.
Cheers.